Good evening, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome all of you tonight here in the whole theater, but also for all of you who are online to this annual Morishima lecture. My name is Ken Milandel. I am professor of economics at the London School of Economics here in the economics department, and I also happen to be the director of Stickered. And Stickered as one of its annual flagship lecture, the Morishima lecture, which is named after the late Michio Morishima, who was a beloved figure in the economics department. He happened to be also the founder and first director of Stickered. And we're extremely fortunate tonight to have in our audience, Mr. Morishima. It's IQ and Ao Morishima. Thank you very much for being here tonight. We're delighted to have you. Let me briefly introduce our speaker tonight to you. We're delighted to have Matt Gentzkow with us. He's the Landau Professor of Economics at Stanford University. Landau has nothing to do with me. I'm not there. Let me be clear, no conflict of interest here. And is one of the most successful scholar in economics in the past 20 years. He graduated from Harvard University in 2004, yes. And since then, his career achievements are absolutely impressive. In 2014, he received the John Gentzkow Medal, which recognizes the best American economist under 40. But in the long list of prizes that he received, let me cite a few, is, for instance, the recipient of the 2016 Calvo Armengol International Prize, a very prestigious prize. He's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science. What's really impressive about Matt's work is the versatility. He employs a wide range of tools from IO, from microtheory, from behavioral econ, to answer questions that previously were not really tackled by economists, and in particular, everything that has to do with media industries and the fabric of persuasion systems. And his lecture tonight is going to be a testament to the greatness of that research agenda. So before I leave the floor to Matt, a few housekeeping things. For those of you who are Twitter, well, ex-Twitter, ex-addicts, there is a hashtag for today's event. Actually, there are two. There is one which is media economics and another one, Stickered. The event is being recorded and is going to be made available as a podcast. I should also mention that, as usual, there's going to be a Q&A after Matt's lecture. You have the possibility to ask a question even if you're online. For this, just put a question in the Q&A, and Zveva, who's right here with us, is going to end and share these questions to me. Okay, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Matt to the lecture. Thank you so much, Matt.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Good. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. It's a huge honor to give this lecture in particular. It really means a lot, and I'm always just incredibly happy to come to LSE. I love it here. There's something about the vibe at this place and the people that always makes me very, very happy to be here. I thought I'd talk today about, I guess, the broad question of social media and its impact on social welfare and social good, which is something that I've been trying to think about some in these last few years and that a lot of people have been trying to work on, and broadly just give you my own very subjective sense of what have we learned over time about the impact of social media, about the way those play out in different domains. So to talk about some bits of my own research, some bits of other people's research, but to try to do something which I think is actually quite hard for me and that I'm not generally very good at, which is to zoom out from all of the details and the usual academic sort of, well, on the one hand this and on the other hand that, and it could go this way and it could go that way, but to try to sort of synthesize that into some clearer, what actually learned and what can we actually take away. I think, to me, a really important starting point for this question and for thinking about these technologies at a time where just about everything we say about these technologies is about how they might be destroying the world, harming people, undermining things, having negative effects, is to remember, these are smartphones and social media together, if you think of it as a bundle, is something that from a typical economist perspective, one might have looked at and thought must be producing tremendous benefits for the world. These are things that billions of people adopted faster than almost any other similar technology in history. They're things that people spend hours and hours every day using. They're things based on a variety of studies that sort of ask people in incentivized ways to how much money they would be willing to give up, or how much money they would accept in order to give up social media for some period of time. Those valuations look like $50 a month, $75 a month, $100 a month. And so these look like technologies that people really, really like and really are spending a huge amount of time on, are willing to pay a lot for. And I would say even in experiments where we've pulled people off of social media, changed what they're doing, people still come back to them and still, even if they have a sort of ambivalent relationship, continue to say, like, I want to be on these platforms and I value them. So before anything else, there's I think like a prior that these technologies have produced something that people really, really love, and that there are a lot of benefits there that we might not want to lose track of as we talk about all of the other sides of this coin. Of course, how big those are remains an open question. Now, the other side of that coin is a very big, if that metaphor works, is a big side of a coin. And there are a lot of things that we've been talking about that are potential harms and downsides of this change. And for the purpose of today, I think it's helpful to kind of organize that into two parts, which we might call, from an economic point of view, externalities and internalities. So by externalities, meaning what are reasons why you spending a lot of time on your phone using social media might have harmful spillover effects on other people or on the rest of society in different ways. Not that it's hurting you, but that by you using it maybe in a way which is perfectly making you happy, which is perfectly good for you, there's negative spillovers. And so that's been largely a conversation about politics and the impact of social media on democracy in particular. There are lots of other kinds of externalities you can think about, but so that includes conversations about the impact on polarization, on the functioning of democracy. What is the impact of misinformation on people's beliefs? How does that impact the political process? In the US, just lately, the question of whether people trust elections and election outcomes has become a particularly salient question. Extreme things like political violence or ethnic violence, and then outside of the political sphere, a whole bunch of other kinds of externalities you can think of, including things like bullying in schools among adolescents. So that's kind of one list of categories of harms. And the other are things that we might call internalities, which is just a way of saying harms that accrue to the person themselves using these technologies. And so, of course, they're only going to be harmful if people are somehow, or they're only going to be harmful in this sense, at least, if people are somehow making a mistake. There's some biases, there's some addiction, there's some reason why people are not really doing what is most in their own interest. And so this includes a whole separate set of conversations that we're having about things like addiction to smartphones, addiction to social media. What are the impacts on mental health? In particular, what are the impacts on mental health for young people, which has been an especially important and remains an especially important conversation. Loneliness, anxiety, depression, at the extremes, things like suicide. So kind of keep in mind that typology of categories of things that we might be worried about. one thing just to kind of insert right at the beginning, because a lot of this is sort of pessimistic. I think a positive note in all of this that's kind of exciting is that the potential for social science to study and understand and get a handle on what is happening and potentially introduce solutions for what is happening are greater with this generation of technology than they have been with many of the previous generations of technologies. So, you know, that I have spent time, other people have spent time thinking about similar kinds of questions related to television. People have spent time thinking about, you know, subsequent generations of media where there are always concerns and panics to some extent of different kinds, as well as other technologies. And I think it is a really positive thing that we have data, we have tools, we have experiments we can run that let us understand these things, potentially address them. Not necessarily that we're doing a great job, certainly not doing a great job maybe of addressing them, and we can decide whether we're doing any good job of understanding them, I guess. But in principle, at least, I think this is an optimistic note here. So what do I want to talk about today? Broadly, what do we know about impact of social media on social welfare from research in the last, say, 10 years? And want to kind of take those two categories of externalities and internalities. And in particular, I'm going to zoom in on the externality side. What have we learned about the relationship between social media and polarization in particular? And on the more internality side, what have we learned about the relationship between social media and well-being and mental health, including this conversation that's ongoing about impacts on adolescents and youth? And as I said, this is not a literature review. It's not an objective kind of overview of things. I'm going to kind of give you my take on what my overall view of this is. And just to give you kind of the preview on these questions, I would say that overall, the evidence over time has made me less concerned and moved toward thinking the magnitudes of the harms we're talking about may be smaller than we thought before when it comes to polarization and when it comes to some of these political impacts. So I think that's, you know, it's still a kind of caveated academic statement. I'm not necessarily saying I think all of those things are small and we don't need to worry about them, but I think the thrust of that evidence has consistently been in the direction of making me think that the political harms we're talking about may be smaller, and also that the scope for policy to address those political harms may be smaller than we might have thought. And conversely, the thrust of this evidence, such as we have, has consistently been in the direction of making me more concerned about these internality kind of effects, the impacts on well-being and mental health, and in particular, the potential impacts on kids and adolescents. So that, I think, to kind of preview the end at the beginning, is the broad sort of thrust of the conclusion. Okay. So let me start thinking about polarization. And I think the first thing to say about this question is that before we get to what's causing it, I think we have learned from the literature that this increase in polarization over time and the issue of political polarization and the impact of that on democracy are really serious and very real issues. So not that long ago, to those of you who know the political science literature, this was a point of great debate, whether polarization is a real phenomenon. There was consensus that polarization among elites was clearly happening, in the sense that if you look at people in politicians who are in the legislature, are politicians becoming more polarized? There was evidence that the answer was yes. But when people were talking about, what about ordinary people, ordinary voters, individuals, what is happening to polarization in the public in general, there was a pretty widespread consensus among academics that that was something like a myth, that people perceived it to be rising and increasing, but that wasn't really the case, or at least had been overstated. And here I think that evidence that we have since then has been very, very clear that polarization is rising and that that has potentially serious consequences. So to give you just a few of those data points to give you the flavor, these are going to be mostly, a lot of the stuff I'm going to show you is going to be largely tilted toward the US, but we'll talk about Europe as well. So this is data from the US, the distributions among Democrats and Republicans of some index of their issue views. So imagine like questions about taxes and trade and abortion that are asked consistently over time. Take 10 of those questions and aggregate them into an index where on one side you have liberal and on the other side you have conservative, and just plot the distribution of those things across people within parties. And what you see is both that the overall distribution is becoming more spread out, and also that the distribution by party in particular is becoming a lot more spread out. So as recently as 2004, there's kind of a remarkable amount of overlap in those two distributions. You had in the Democratic Party in the US, a lot of relatively conservative people, and in the Republican Party, a lot of relatively liberal people. Those have spread apart in a way that we can see quite vividly, visually. You can see that in presidential approval ratings. So this is a kind of crazy looking plot, but if you stare at it for a sec, you can understand what's going on. So this is approval ratings of US presidents going back to Eisenhower. So we have Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and so on across the top. The red line is always approval rating among Republicans, and the blue line is approval rating among Democrats. So you see those flip when the party of the president flips, because people always approve their own party president more than the out party president. What can you see over time? There's actually two patterns here that are interesting. The obvious one is that those are spreading apart. So there's this growing divergence, which is another measure you could think of polarization, is just we now have presidents where 80, 90% of people in their own party approve of them, and 10, 5, 7% of people in the opposite party approve of them. But also what's a little bit more subtle maybe is if you look back in history at these earlier periods, there's a lot of correlation and co-movement between these lines. There are things that happen that cause people in both parties to approve of the president less, or things that happen that cause people in both parties to approve of the president more, and which is what you might expect as voters are responding to information and events and things that happen. And in the beginning with the Obama presidency, it's sort of a short time series there, but you see much less of that. And under Obama and under Trump, there was just kind of like nothing in terms of external events were shifting people's views much at all, which seems related to the kind of hardening of these polarized positions. Now, there is some agreement at the very end on people not liking Joe Biden. So that's kind of gone down among everybody, complicating the picture. But I think that's another place that we see evidence of polarization. Maybe the most dramatic place you see it is if you forget about issue views, you forget about presidents, and just look at how people feel about each other. So there's been a lot of work on this notion of affective polarization in terms of people's feelings. Goes back to work by Shanto Iyengar and others who are political scientists. This is a plot of just what share of people in each party say that their view of the opposite party is very unfavorable. You can see that has increased dramatically. And so just about any measure of like negative feeling toward the out party, attributing terrible traits to the out party. Do you think that they're selfish? Do you think they're biased? Do you think that they're stupid? Do you think that they're... All of those things have gone up quite dramatically. If you put, this is from some work of ours from a while back, if you put together a number of those different components, issue views, affective polarization and feelings, and a number of other of these measures that we've seen rising, this is the overall time series that you get. And so it's clearly going up. I think other things that are important to note are that going up is quite a long-term trend. That long-term trend is something that clearly predates the internet and also clearly predates social media, which doesn't mean social media is not accelerating it, not causing it, not playing a role. And you might see some uptick here, 2020, but overall the general rise has been a slow and steady thing over quite a bit of time. So all of that is to say, I think polarization is clearly rising. Understanding why that's happening is important, the implications of that. There's a whole separate literature on how does that impact democracy, but those impacts, as far as we can tell, are not very good. So we'd like to understand what's going on. So getting to then, what do we know about what social media has to do with it? I want to start with a couple of facts, again, from some earlier work of ours, which I would describe as like circumstantial evidence. So not yet experimental evidence, not causal evidence, circumstantial in the sense of descriptive patterns we can see in the world that don't settle the question definitively, don't tell us exactly what's going on, but I think help inform us and point in the direction of what we might think is going on. So first of those sort of circumstantial evidence points is to think about who within society is getting the most polarized as we look across different people, different demographic groups. An observation that you might have, something that might be intuitive, is that if social media, digital technologies in general, and social media are in particular key drivers of that increase in polarization, that would seem to imply particular groups of people who might be most at risk of that happening. Because if you think about who uses social media, particularly going back in time, it's not evenly distributed. So this is from some work, just a flag, with Levi Boxell and Jesse Shapiro in a paper that we wrote that was in PNAS. A particular dimension of demographics that is very obviously related to how much people use social media is age. And so a fact that should not be surprising is that this is still true today. Certainly until 2016, there were far more young people using social media than older people. And so you might expect a pattern where, at least in a simple view of the world, if social media is the key driver, we might see particularly strong increases in polarization among younger people who are the ones using it, and not so much increase in polarization among older people who use it at much, much lower rates, almost zero up until 2012. And that's just sort of the opposite of what we actually see in terms of the long-term trends. So these are plots of that index I showed you before of the increase in polarization by age, broken down into 4 age groups. And you can see polarization is rising among all age groups, but if anything is rising the most among the oldest people, and that has been true for quite a long time. And so these 75-plus-year-old, 65-plus-year-old people are not using social media heavily. That doesn't, again, it's kind of circumstantial fact. It doesn't prove anything. It could be that these people are the small number of older people who are using social media are getting very polarized. It could be that their grandchildren are using social media and then polarizing them. It could be that all sorts of things keep on, but I think it's an informative fact. Second question that you could ask, I think, along similar lines, circumstantial evidence, is what does the pattern of this look like across different countries? And again, social media, digital technologies are things that have, broadly speaking, arrived everywhere around the same time. And if those are kind of key drivers, we might expect to see that there are similar trends in polarization among many different countries. So this is some facts from a paper with those same co-authors from a year ago. And what we're going to do for this cross-country comparison is zoom in on this specific measure, which is called effective polarization, which is like the feelings measure that I told you. Basically, think of it as how negatively do people feel about the other people in their society who are not part of their own party. And so that, if you just look at the US, that has gone up steadily, like the other things we talked about, since 1980, where we have data. The reason that we're going to zoom in on this effective polarization measure is because it's something that we can actually measure across a lot of different countries. There's not like a comparable issue index that you can measure across countries, but lots of different countries have surveys where people are asked some version of how positive do you feel toward these people from the other party? How negatively do you feel about them? So this is what you get for the US. The magnitude here, by the way, is precisely like on a 0 to 100 scale. people are asked how they feel about their own party, people in their own party, how they feel about people in out parties, and then this is the difference between those two. So that's been going up in the US. And the question is, how does that look elsewhere in the world? Do we see that same increase in countries in Europe? Do we see the same increase everywhere, or does it look very different? And the answer, I think somewhat to our surprise, is it actually looks quite different as you look across countries. So the US turns out to be, of the 12 countries that we're able to look at in this study, the one that has the strongest increase in polarization as measured in this way. I've kind of sorted things here by the strength of that association. So polarization has gone up the most by this measure over this period in the US. Switzerland has kind of sparse data. We don't have as many years, but to the extent you can tell, it's also gone up there. Somewhat less so in France, Denmark, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, Australia, UK, Norway, Sweden, Germany. So instead of a pattern of increasing effective polarization everywhere, what we see is a lot of heterogeneity across countries, ranging from places where it's gone up to places where it's gone down. Now, a couple of things just to highlight here to help you make sense of this if you're sort of sitting there thinking like, that sounds wrong. One, remember the time frame we're looking at, right, is quite long here. So saying, for example, in the UK that this looks flat is not saying that polarization in the UK has not gone up in, say, the last 5 years. And indeed, there are a number of these countries where you can see a little blip up, since 2000 in the recent years. So this in no way rules out something like Brexit in the UK drove more polarization. A second thing to flag about it is that these measures get complicated when you apply them to countries that have many parties. And so there's a question of, in the US, it's kind of simple because we have like Democrats and Republicans. How do they feel about each other? How do you do that in a country like Germany or Sweden or many others where there are many, many parties? What we're plotting here is how does each person feel about the average other person who is not part of their party? Does that make sense? So if there were 5 parties, I'm in party 1, I'm asked, how do I feel about people in party 2, party 3, party 4, party 5, and we're going to average those weighted by how many people are in those parties. So what's that going to do? It's really focusing on kind of the largest parties. And in many countries where there's like has been a big center left party and a big center right party, it's going to be very similar to if you just take the top 2 parties in each country and compare them. Now, something that is not going to show up as a big increase in effective polarization, given that way of measuring it, is suppose that there is a new far right party that starts out very, very small and grows from 1% to 10% or 15%. And everybody in the country hates those people, and those people hate everybody else in the country. That is still not going to register here as a big increase because still the average, they're still small relative to the average. So if you think about like what's happening in Germany, this is driven by the fact that polarization is measured between the 2 large center right, center left parties in Germany really has decreased steadily over time. You see that also in the legislature. If you look at measures of roll call voting in Germany, it's really decreased. At the same time, there's been, in recent years, the rise of AfD and other right-wing parties. So I think that's like an important kind of caveat to keep in the back of your mind in looking at this. But, and you can see, this is just data to highlight the fact that indeed, since 2000, there has been this really large increase in both left-wing and right-wing populist parties in Europe, as well as this is like a sample of 60 countries around the world. So I think that's an important, in a sense, caveat to these data, but nevertheless, this pattern looking across countries is again different from what you might expect if social media was like the primary engine driving these changes in effective polarization, because if social media was the primary engine, we would expect perhaps a more uniform pattern across countries. Circumstantial, not definitive, but I think pointing a little bit in that direction. Okay. So think of that as kind of backdrop. Then or more than backdrop. I think those are helpful facts, and they're also going to be returned to some randomized experiments. I'll talk a bunch about what are the limitations of the randomized experiments that we have. One of them is going to be, we can only do randomized experiments currently looking at current changes over relatively short time horizons. So one of the things that's important about that more descriptive evidence is it's the only evidence we have where we can look back over long stretches of time and see what's happening. But so we have that evidence. What about more directly measured causal impacts of social media on polarization? So this is something where there's been quite a bit of work just in recent years, where I think this fact that the technology and the data and so on gives us some really interesting traction is quite exciting. There's work other people have done. There's some prior work that I've done with co-authors. What I thought I'd focus on today is telling you about a set of studies that we've just been releasing in the last 9 months or so, which come from experiments that were done around the 2020 presidential election in the US. And so these are the actual experiments were a few years ago. This project had a kind of strange and, in retrospect, somewhat costly in a sense ground rule, which was that we couldn't present or share, post publicly any of these studies until they were actually published. So, and that process of publication took a little while. So we're now able to talk about them, which is, I think, very exciting. So this is an unusual thing, this project. It was a collaboration between Meta and a group of academics that really began with Meta reaching out to academics and saying, we would like to have an independent evaluation of the impact of Facebook and Instagram on the 2020 election. And the academics involved talked about that and thought about what are the terms under which we would be willing to do something like that. And in particular, how might one structure a collaboration in such a way that we could have some confidence that the integrity and independence of the research would be preserved, which is not a trivial thing. There's also all kinds of practical things about how would you work with them, how would you access the data, how would things be secure, how would you preserve privacy. We came up with a structure, which I'm not going to tell you a ton about the details, but included some important guardrails that were agreed on upfront and which were followed through on. The first is all of the studies had to be pre-registered and would be executed as pre-registered. Meta's not giving us any money. They have no right to block publication or release of any of the findings based on what the findings are. There's like a privacy and legal review just for legitimate privacy concerns. And the academic, although there are Meta co-authors on these papers, the academic lead authors on the papers have final control rights. So every sentence, if there's any dispute about any sentence written in the paper or any analysis, we're the ones deciding. I could also say another piece of this that you might be kind of wondering that I think is important to think about is how are the questions chosen? How are the topics chosen? That's something where if you have a kind of adversarial view of this, you could imagine Meta is going to be able to influence the research a lot by kind of picking and choosing, which questions do we let you ask to direct those toward things that we have like particular prior are going to go in a certain way. What I can tell you is of the part of it that I was involved in, we came up with a set of questions we wanted to ask and study designs we wanted to execute, and those were approved basically as we asked to do them. So there was no filtering there. Now that you may say like, that reveals the limits of our creativity and thinking of what to ask for, and we should have asked for other things or different things or better things, but that was how it happened. So as part of this, it means that we have the opportunity to measure outcomes for a large population through surveys, also through access to data from platforms and external administrative data sets that we can link. And we have the ability, among other things, to do experiments, as I'll tell you about, that kind of turn dials on the news feeds on Facebook and Instagram in ways that are hard to do in some of our prior work on this. We did it with no cooperation with Meta, just sort of from the outside. And there's some things that you can do well that way, but this collaboration makes it easier, makes it possible to do some kinds of treatments that we couldn't do before. These are the kind of core authors that are part of this team. So it's a long list. There's a set of researchers who work at Meta who did a lot of back-end work, and then a set of academics that is mostly, well, people across a whole range of disciplines, a bunch of political scientists, communication scholars, sociologists, and others, including Gentzkow and I, who are economists. So let me talk through, again, we're going to kind of focus here on the polarization part of this. There are other outcomes we look at. One of these studies is what we called a deactivation experiment. Maybe I just kind of give you the overview. There's this deactivation experiment, which I'll talk about first. There's then a set of what we call platform experiments, which, as I mentioned, are sort of tuning in different ways the newsfeed to do things like show more or less like-minded content or vary how much viral content there is, things like that. And then I'm not going to talk about today, but there are also a set of descriptive studies which are not randomized, but doing things like measuring how much echo chambers, like to what extent are people segregated in what they're seeing on the platform, how do different kinds of content diffuse on the platform, how does misinformation diffuse through the platform differently from non-misinformation, questions like that. So this one is the deactivation experiment. And that's what it sounds like. We're going to randomize people into a treatment where they turn off their Facebook account or their Instagram account entirely for the run-up to the election. Why would we want to do that? You can think of the purpose of doing that as getting a measure of the overall total all-in impact of, I'm getting too excited. Overall impact of these platforms on attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, i.e. what is different if you're on Facebook versus not at all, or on Instagram versus not at all. This builds on some prior work from a previous couple years back that Gentzkow and I did with Sarah Eichmeyer and Luca Braghieri. And in this case, we have the opportunity to do this with a really big sample. We have about 35,000 people, and this deactivation period is about 6 weeks long. So how did this work? We have separate samples of Facebook and Instagram users. So you want to think of it as kind of like two separate experiments. There's a Facebook experiment where people are recruited on Facebook, an Instagram experiment where they're recruited on Instagram. The Facebook people turn off Facebook, the Instagram people turn off Instagram. They're recruited on the platform. You have to live in the US, be at least 18 years old, have logged in at least once in the past month. And for this deactivation experiment specifically, we're going to focus on people who say they use the platform at least 15 minutes a day at baseline. We're not so interested in what is the effect of turning off Facebook for people who don't use Facebook very much. The population of interest is people who use it quite a bit. And more specifically, the design is we're going to have two groups people are randomized into. A treatment group that's paid to deactivate their account for 6 weeks, and a control group, which might sound unusual to you, also deactivates their account, but for just 1 week. So instead of having a control group that just does nothing, there's like a design choice here, which is to have the control group also have a very short period of deactivation. Why are we doing that? There are a couple of reasons. One is you could think of it broadly as just trying to balance the experience, treatment and control, and make them more similar. If there's something specific to just going through this deactivation experience. We were really concerned about attrition from the study being different for these two groups, and this helps balance it out. There's also, I think, a concern about something like experimenter demand effects, where people are aware here that they're in an experiment. It's very hard to do an experiment like this and not have people, like a double-blind deactivation experiment where people don't know that they're part of an experiment turning off their Facebook account. So people are aware of it, and being aware of it could impact their perceptions and how they answer survey questions. This doesn't solve it, but I think having this short deactivation period for the control group helps at least mean that everybody is part of an experiment that they perceive to be related to turning off. Okay, so we do that. The sort of eligible set of people who are randomized in the study are those who express willingness to do this. So if you said you'd need to pay me $1,000 to turn off my Facebook account, you're not part of this study. So the treatment effects, the effects we're measuring are local to people who are willing to do that, which is an important caveat here. It's like a specific population. And the deactivation is implemented directly by Meta. If you want to, you may change your mind, decide to forfeit these payments, log back into your accounts and use them. So this is sort of the first stage of this experiment. This is what the compliance with that treatment looks like. So this plot shows the share of people on a given day who logged into their Facebook account separately for the control group and the deactivation group. And you can see in the sort of pre-period before the experiment, that's about 85 to 90%. So not everybody logs into their Facebook account every day, but maybe somewhat shockingly, they do log into it like 90% of the time. So it's pretty high. This darker gray region is the week where both the control group and the deactivation group have their accounts deactivated. So you can see the compliance is not 100%, but it's sort of 10 to 15% are not complying, and 85% or so are complying. We'll adjust for that in the estimates. And then this is the 5-week period where the control group is able to reactivate their accounts if they want to, and the deactivation group remains deactivated. So this is kind of the treatment that we're measuring. Notice this kind of interesting fact that even after the experiment is over, those groups don't totally converge. So this is consistent with other work of ours and others showing there is a real persistent kind of habit formation effect of like, you take a detox month from social media and people mostly come back, but not entirely. And people are also, if you look at usage, people's usage here is substantially lower. This is the same thing for Instagram, and you see it looks very similar. More people come back to Instagram. That gap is smaller, but otherwise the pattern is similar. So I'm going to show you a few treatment effects from this experiment. They're going to be on a plot like this, where the units are standard deviations of the outcome. These are point estimates and then confidence intervals. This is for Facebook, for the Facebook deactivation. And I want to start by talking about knowledge. So a first question that you can ask in this context is, does being on Facebook impact what people know and believe about the world? Before we get to polarization, does it have any impact on people's beliefs? There are two measures here, and then this is an index of these two plus a third measure. Ignore this for now. This is sort of like an index that's pre-registered. There's no detectable effect either way, but that turns out to mask kind of interesting pattern of effects that are offsetting. So news knowledge falls when people are off of Facebook. News knowledge is an index of like news quiz kind of questions. Do people know real facts about things that are happening in the world? So when people are off of Facebook, they know less about the world. They're less good at answering news quiz questions by about 1/10 of a standard deviation. Fact knowledge, which I think in retrospect, maybe we could have found a better name, is really a measure of misinformation beliefs, where we ask people questions about true or false questions about things that were widely circulated on Facebook during this period and also flagged by third-party fact checkers as misinformation. And so a positive number here means when you were off of Facebook, you had better fact knowledge, which means you were less likely to agree with misinformation. Okay? So what those two effects together say is when people are on Facebook, they are both more likely to know real things about the world and more likely to believe in misinformation. And when they're off of Facebook, they're both less likely to know real stuff and also less likely to believe in misinformation. This is marginally significant, and it's significant here unadjusted. If we adjust for multiple hypothesis testing, it doesn't quite meet our pre-registered threshold for significance. So that's an important caveat, but I think you can see this pattern. This is just examples of the kind of misinformation claims that we're kicking around. So these things are not really statistically different from each other, but just to have a flavor, the things that have the largest point estimates are like some claim about Hunter Biden's laptop, Joe Biden's son. Millions of fraudulent ballots were cast in the 2020 election. Joe Biden is a pedophile. There's some other things that were widely circulated misinformation. Here then is the impact on polarization. We have two measures of polarization relating to what I showed you before. One, affective polarization, one that's an index of issues. And you can see that none of these effects are significant. There's maybe a very small negative effect based on the point estimate on effective polarization, but it's not significantly different from zero. The effects on issue polarization are very small. And so overall, if there is any impact on polarization here, we can rule out it being more than about 5/100ths of a standard deviation. So, which is small, I think, based on a number of different benchmarks. And we also don't find any meaningful change for these people who are off of Facebook on perceived legitimacy of the election. It's a little confusing because we had that fact knowledge question about the 2020 election, which shows a hint of something. This is like a wider index of what you think about perceived, whether the election was conducted legitimately. And that also doesn't change significantly that we can detect. And the magnitudes, if you think about the size of the confidence interval, are relatively tight. Like if you think about how much of the gap between Republicans and Democrats in this perceived legitimacy could have been affected, these confidence intervals say that would be less than 5%. Okay, so that's the deactivation experiment. We could talk more about the magnitudes and the confidence intervals, but I would summarize that as saying we do not see any meaningful, substantial changes in polarization, whether people were on Facebook in that period or not. We quickly summarize the platform experiments then. So here, instead of taking people off of Facebook and Instagram, we're going to change some things about their newsfeed. And there are 4 experiments, which are like 4 separate papers. The first gets rid of the algorithm altogether and just says people are going to see content chronologically on both Facebook and Instagram. So no algorithmic filtering at all. You just see things in the order that they're posted. The second experiment turns off all reshared content, which you can think about as sort of turning off viral content that is circulating because it's being reshared by lots of people. So that's a kind of shutting down that virality channel. The third is to downrank content from like-minded sources. So we have a measure based on the platform data of who in your Facebook network of people, pages, groups on Facebook does it look like share your political ideology? And we're going to downrank content from them and thereby uprank content from people either of the opposite political ideology or just of no particular political ideology. And finally, there's an experiment where we just turned off all political ads on the platform for this same kind of 6-week period before the election. This just indicates we did all these things on Facebook. These things are not feasible on Instagram, but the chrono feed and political ads treatments were on Instagram too. And I'm not going to have time to go through the details of all of these, but just to give you the high level summary is quite consistent, I think, across most of these papers. Broadly speaking, these interventions had big impacts on, first of all, in some cases, how much time people spend on the platform. So like the chrono feed treatment, where we just rank things chronologically, led to a substantial reduction in how much time people spent. You might hope that that's true, because if that's not true, like a bunch of people probably at Meta should lose their jobs because they just spent 15 years figuring out how to maximize time spent on the platform with these algorithms. But also across these treatments, they had big impacts on the content that people saw, the mix of content that people saw. However, the impacts on polarization and pretty much all other, some few small exceptions, political attitudes and behaviors we can measure are very precise zeros across these studies, which is, again, consistent with the sense that the impacts here on polarization, at least of this kind of short-term treatment, are fairly small. This is just to give you a hint of, like, in the like-minded study, what does the first stage look like here? So this is what share of content in people's feed comes from like-minded sources. Remember, the alternatives are both like opposite-minded sources or also just neutral, people who are not categorized. That number is about 55%, and the treatment reduces it by about a third. That's for various technical reasons about the most, as far as it was possible to turn that dial. But despite that, these are estimates of impacts on political outcomes. This is a little more zoomed out because there's some other things on this chart that I'm not showing you. So this is a wide x-axis scale relative to what I was showing you before, but still you can see the effects on polarization and ideological extremity here are just like very, very precise zeros. Now, there's a long list of important caveats associated with this study. You can probably give me more to add to this slide, but let me tick off some that I think I really want you to keep in mind. First, this is a short-term intervention for 6 weeks. The research question that we're trying to answer here is, does it matter whether people are on social media in the election season? Does the exposure, there's all kinds of stuff happening in this period. Donald Trump was circulating all kinds of stuff about mail-in ballots being fraudulent, and there were discussions about lots of different events and campaigns of voter suppression, number of different things that were going on. And the question is whether that content has an impact in that short-term period. That's a very different question from how would polarization have been different if Facebook never existed, or what would be the longer-term impact of a much longer intervention like this. We're always measuring average effects here for the most part. We look at a bunch of heterogeneity, but we can never rule out that there are small minorities of people who might be heavily impacted in ways we're not picking up. Really important, this is an individual level treatment. It's changing one person's experience, holding constant what the whole rest of the world and all their friends are doing. A treatment where we took everybody off of Facebook for 6 weeks. We shut down the Facebook platform for 6 weeks. That could have a very different impact. This is a big presidential election where people are saturated with a ton of information. So even if we learn that the marginal impact in that election is small, that doesn't rule out the fact that these impacts on things like polarization could be big in a small election. Indeed, our previous study finds somewhat larger and more significant impacts on polarization in a midterm election in the US. And there are a bunch of other channels. It could be that people are getting a lot of their information through TV, but what's on TV is different because of social media. And it also could be that what our politicians are doing and what Donald Trump is doing, what various political elites are doing could also be impacted by social. So those are all important caveats. Nevertheless, I think these were experiments that we thought, really give us some look at least in this short run sense, what is the impact, and those impacts seem to be small. So the circumstantial evidence, I would say, leans against social media being a central driver, and the experimental evidence consistently, to a degree I find kind of surprising and remarkable, shows minimal impacts on polarization in the short-term sense. Okay. So let me turn then to the other side of, I guess I now have the other side of the coin, which is an even worse metaphor. The other part of this, which is well-being and mental health impacts. And I want to present this to you kind of in a similar way, starting with what we would think of as similar kinds of circumstantial evidence. What do they show? We saw things like age patterns and cross-country patterns look inconsistent with large effects. So some basic facts that I think are notable in this context. So we can think both about well-being, mental health impacts on adult populations and also on adolescents. Among adults, some of our prior work and other people's work, it's very clear people just have a sense that they are not happy with their own use of these platforms. Many, many people report that they wish they spent less time, that they wish that they used their phones less, that they wish they used social media less. That's not definitive. That could be social desirability bias, all kinds of other things, but it's suggestive. Based on measures of addiction, There are survey-based measures of addiction, kind of psychometric scales. We also have a separate paper trying to measure addiction in a different way, more grounded in the behavioral economics literature, which I'll just allude to. I won't have time to go through in detail, but those suggest addiction is real in this context. Among adolescents, there is this growing, it's fair to say there's some dispute about this, but I think that dispute is waning, that there really is a mental health crisis among adolescents that begins in the early 2010s. And just the hours that people are spending are very, very high, which suggests they're crowding out a lot of something. And that might be important. If many of you may have read John Haidt's new book, at least most people in the world seem to be reading this book these days, that this book has gotten a lot of attention. I think actually most of the evidence in it is updating previous evidence from John's work and Jean Twenge's work and others, but putting it together in a way which has really kind of crystallized this discussion, I think, in an important way. We could talk about and debate the conclusions in that book, the recommendations in that book, but I think what I want to highlight is just it collects some of these circumstantial data points on just what do these trends look like. And so this is, for example, episodes of major depression among teens. You see those have really increased to an alarming degree. And you see a pattern that's consistent across many different measures, many different contexts of both the level and the increase being bigger for girls. It's actually a similar percentage increase, I think, in these two. And also that there's kind of roughly speaking an inflection point around 2010 to 2015, which is the period of time when the iPhone grew and social media was, kind of transformed and widely used. So circumstantial doesn't prove anything, but suggests that there might be something going on. We talked with polarization about age patterns, and age patterns being kind of inconsistent with what you might expect if social media was a key driver. Here, the age patterns kind of the opposite. These increases are quite clearly concentrated among younger people. I mean, here they're teens, so we see huge increases among teens. If you look at other age groups, older age groups, there are also large increases among 18 to 25, and they kind of get smaller as people get older, which is consistent with who was using social media over this period being an important driver. We talked about the pattern across countries with polarization being somewhat inconsistent. Here, there's lots of debate and discussion in this literature, but I think broadly speaking, most OECD countries, roughly speaking, that one looks at, you see similar kinds of trends. This is in Canada. Here, the measure is not something bad, but you have very good mental health. So that's fallen and fallen more for the youngest groups. This is self-harm episodes in the UK, which increased over this period sharply. This is measured from like hospital data, particularly among girls. This is in Scandinavia. You see a similar increase. You can look at other countries, Australia, others. So I think that's in a similar vein to the other circumstantial evidence. I think it's enough to me to say there's something here that we might want to pay attention to and might be concerned about. Many, many people have pointed out correctly that that kind of time series evidence doesn't prove anything. There's a financial crisis, there's a whole variety of things that happen over that period, but I think it's suggestive and enough that we should think about it and be concerned. The next category of studies here are, there are similar ones actually for polarization I didn't talk about, but in this context, there is a large body of evidence of what you could call correlational studies, which take kind of two forms: cross-sectional correlational studies, where someone has something like survey evidence, and it has a measure of how much people use social media, and it has a measure of their mental health, and we're in some way looking at the association of those two things. And then there's a longitudinal version of that where we're looking at changes over time. So when in months when people use social media more, do they also feel happy more or sad more? I think for this audience, I maybe don't need to belabor the point that what we can learn from this kind of evidence is, I think, limited. And this is a context where it's become very, I think in a way counterproductive, because we can think about the biases in this kind of correlational evidence. What we expect those to produce is a lot of inconsistency in results, where sort of depending what you control for and depending how you do things, correlations can go different ways. And that's led to, I think people have seen exactly that pattern in this literature, and that's led to some confusion. Just to spell it out, as usual with this kind of evidence, there's a very clear channel of reverse causality here, which is when people are not feeling good, they spend a lot of time sitting at home alone. And something you do when you're sitting at home alone is you spend a lot of time on your phone. In addition, think about why might somebody be using social media and smartphones more. There's a whole range of omitted variables. Who are your parents? What is their background? What is your income? How are your friends doing? What's happening at school? All of these kinds of things that can impact both mental health and social media. So the causation here is very complicated. We're trying to measure the effect of phones on your mental health, but your mental health is impacting the phones, and there are these other things that impact both. And I think in this context, like with lots of other media, it's almost better to ask the question in the other way and say, what can you think of that changes how much an adolescent is using social media that would not potentially also be associated with differences in other things in their life, like their mental health? So imagine I show you two girls, 13 years old, who are kind of matched on some demographics, have similar demographic backgrounds, and I tell you one of them is spending 5.5 hours on social media per day and the other 1.5 hours. Imagine what are all of the reasons that might be true. And can we think of any reasons? Maybe you can think of some. I could maybe think of some, but can you think of any reasons that would explain this that would not be independently correlated somehow potentially with measures like mental health or well-being or how people are doing? If it's something about the rules that their parents have, if it's where they spend their time, if it's what kind of friends do they have, their social environment, their school, all those things would be potentially correlated. And I think the same thing, there's a lot of discussion out there right now that is premised on the idea that longitudinal versions of these studies are more convincing. If you read the public health and psychology literature on this, there's a very strong emphasis on well, now we have longitudinal versions of these studies. I think it's not obvious to me that they're any more convincing at all. So if I say, instead of that cross-sectional difference, suppose I tell you that this person, they both spent 1.5 hours on social media in the first week, but this person increased their usage dramatically in this second week. By the same token, well, what happened? Why did they, if we want to say, if this was a week that this person was feeling sad and unhappy, can we attribute that as the causal impact of this, or did something else? So I think I'm probably preaching to the choir for many people here, but I think that we need to be really careful. What has been found is very inconsistent results. Some studies find large associations, others find small or none. It depends on the sample and what you control for. There's a lot of people saying these correlational studies, because the correlations are actually small and inconsistent, we can conclude from that there's not a causal effect here, and we don't need to worry about the impact of smartphones on kids. I think that we should take these kinds of studies with a grain of salt, both when they do find a relationship, but also some of these negative results that have also got a lot of attention. So what do we know on this question from randomized experiments? Here, I think, unfortunately, the evidence base is smaller even than it is for the political questions. And in particular, we have almost no large-scale, well, almost no experiments and no large-scale experiments that I think would kind of satisfy all the criteria we would love to see among adolescents. So almost all of the experimental work involves college students or adult populations. But we can learn something even from those. This is like the previous paper that I had mentioned. It was another deactivation experiment. We looked at some political stuff here, but we also looked at subjective well-being. So think about a similar experiment where we're pulling people off of Facebook, in this case for a month. Could look at how that changes their self-reported happiness and mental health and well-being, a number of different dimensions. So this is about a much smaller sample in 2018, about 1,500 people. And here are the treatment effects you see. So this is the same kind of plot, standard deviation units. and these effects. And we can look at a bunch of different measures of happiness, life satisfaction, loneliness, depression, anxiety, and so on, which we sort of roll up into an index of subjective well-being. And here you see effects of around 1/10 of a standard deviation improvement in people's self-reported happiness and well-being when they're off of Facebook. Can think about, is that a big effect or a small effect? I wouldn't call it a big effect. I think you might call it a small to moderate effect. It is fairly large relative to point estimates of the impact of things like a week or two of psychotherapy, other experiments people have done. So in that sense, it's not too small. There's also a reduction, as I said, in usage post-experiment, but these are, I think, kind of like moderate-sized impacts in the direction of experimentally, if we take people off of social media, they do feel better. I mentioned this addiction study we have. So this, I won't tell you all of how we did this, but it was like experimental interventions that were designed to get at two things. One is there this kind of habit formation process with social media where the more you use it, the more you want to use it. That's kind of a hallmark of addictive goods, that if I give you more heroin today, you're gonna like want more heroin tomorrow. You can ask the same question, if I give you more social media today, are you gonna have increased demand in the future? And the other is to look at like temptation, that people find that they're using it more than they themselves would like to commit themselves to use it. Both of those things are big and important, and they apply if you turned off the kind of temptation mistakes part of that, people would be using social media about 1/3 less. So in that sense, something like 1/3 of social media minutes are due to addiction. We also have a paper, which I can't tell you about yet because of those rules that I mentioned. So I'm not going to tell you the results, but I can tell you that as part of the election study, the ground rules of that whole project were it needed to be limited to the impacts of the election on primarily political outcomes. But as part of that, it was approved that we could look at a small number of subjective well-being, mental health kind of questions, particularly thinking about them in the context of the election. How is being on Facebook impacting people's well-being and happiness during an election season? What's neat about this paper, I think, is, you remember that sample was really big, like 35,000 people in that deactivation experiment. That means we have enough sample size that we can really zoom in on the youngest people in that sample. We have Instagram, which is has played a particularly important role in the conversation about these impacts on mental health, because Facebook is not the primary thing that young people are using these days. Instagram is much more important. And we'll be able to estimate results separately by gender, which, as you saw from the kind of descriptive evidence, there's this like strong prior that these effects seem to particularly fall on girls. So I can't tell you the results, but we'll be able to say, do we see impacts, and are they particularly large for young girls? Are they particularly large for young women? Are they particularly large for Instagram, and how is Instagram different? Finally, there's like a small set of other randomized experiments that find somewhat divergent results, but I think are broadly consistent with the view that experimentally taking people off does seem to improve their mental health and well-being. So these experiments also have really important caveats. They're short. That's very different from long-run effects. They measure the average effect, as I said. This point is like even more important here. It's hugely important in this context, that think about a 13-year-old. What is the impact of pulling a 13-year-old off of social media in a world where all of her friends are still using it? Could be a completely different thing from what if none of her friends were using it, and what if we just like took it away altogether. And those, for anybody who's like looking for dissertation topics or thinking of work to do, I think, figuring out how to get experiments that are well powered to look at those kind of group effects, figuring out those broader, how are the group effects different from individual effects, is a really important thing that it's like next frontier of this literature we really need. And we could just go around and say experiments show that using social media makes people sad and anxious and depressed. that is true in a statistical sense, but it's important to keep in mind the experimental effect sizes are not huge, and so are not on their own going to account for something like this huge run-up that we saw in the time series. Okay. Last thing I'll say, and then wrap up and take some questions. There's also the other part of this that I think has really moved my prior is a very small number of natural experiments that also are able to look at impacts on mental health and well-being. And the really important thing, this is, I think, a great example for, students or people who are thinking about, it was a great example for me to learn, thinking about pros and cons of different methodologies. Sometimes we have this idea that, like, if you can do an RCT, you can do an experiment, that's better. And that you only would do some natural experiment if you couldn't do an RCT. And I think the really important thing is, look at this list. These are all things that in some of these natural experimental studies are addressed because they can be longer term, they can be collective, and so on. So there's this paper that by Luca Braghieri, Roy Levy, and Alexei Makarin, which was published in the AR in 2022, which I think is, I find a really striking and convincing study that looked at the rollout of Facebook across US colleges. That's a really great experiment because Facebook, the limitation is it happened over a short period of time, but Facebook came to different colleges at different times. And when it arrived, it was huge. Like 80% of people were using it within a few weeks in some places. And so they can look at that and look at how using really rich, both like survey data, but that also includes measures of contact with, diagnoses, contact with the mental health system. They find significant impacts all in the direction of cohorts that had access to Facebook, had worse mental health in that year in college. And it falls across a bunch of these different measures. It's about, again, 1/10 of a standard deviation, similar effect size on the overall. And there's a number of other more recent papers like this. This is like a recent working paper by Sarah Abrahamson that I think, is still in process. There's still work to do, but is looking at like rollout of cell phone bans in schools across Norway and finds meaningful impacts where cell phone bans are associated with improved mental health and better academic performance for kids. So bottom line on that stuff, I think the causal evidence is not conclusive. People who are kind of, there's like some people like John Haidt who are going very far in the direction of saying, we know that social media is the cause of all of this. I don't agree with that. I think we have to be cautious. However, I also think we have enough evidence to say there's a real significant probability that these harms are real and potentially large. There's an important dimension here, which is if we think about policy, the existence of those social spillovers or group effects or peer effects create a specific and distinctive rationale for policy. This isn't, if there are harms, it's not something parents can easily solve themselves. If what we need is everybody to, is all of the 6th graders to not be using Instagram, no individual parent can do that. I think we can think about both what are the potential harms and also what are the potential benefits and how would we weigh those. So to end that on polarization, I would say broadly, the evidence has made me less worried, not unworried, not at all worried, but has moved me in that direction. I also think this is policy implications. If we think specifically about policy in that domain, the policy levers we have are also not great. Think about how might we change content on social media? How might we make social media less polarizing? We did a bunch of those things in that experiment, which are along the lines that have been proposed, like chronological feed or downrank like-minded content. Those things had no impact. So we have weak policy tools and evidence that has I think, moved away from seeing really serious harms. On the flip side, with well-being and mental health, I think the evidence is, if anything, made me more worried. Social spillovers, as we said, provide a strong rationale for policy. I think that this is a really important example of a context where our tendency to say the causal evidence isn't there yet, therefore we shouldn't do anything, is potentially really dangerous. I think we need to be thinking about good decision-making under uncertainty. And if we say there's a 30% probability that these harms are large, a policy like some minimum age restrictions for usage of social media think about, on one hand, we might be with 20%, 40%, 60% probability avoiding some really substantial dramatic harms associated with things including suicide. And on the other side, suppose we got it wrong, and actually there was no reason not to let 12-year-olds use Instagram. Is the harm there commensurate? Would we say that the loss from a generation of 12-year-olds not being able to be on Instagram was something we should be really, really worried about? I don't want to minimize that, because there is evidence that like kids, there are lots of benefits and things so kids like, but to me, that trade-off feels like I'm confident saying, I think we need to be pretty aggressive based on the probability of harm here. And unlike this is a case where the policy levers we have really are powerful. All that said, we don't want to forget there are real benefits in the background that we need to keep in mind. Okay, so with that, let me take some questions.
Yeah, exactly.